So Carl Johnson is a gardener with the U.S. Botanic Gardens collections team. He holds a plant science degree from the University of Connecticut, where he was the president of the Horticulture Club and worked in the university greenhouses. Today, he's going to introduce us to a plant propagation technique called air layering. So with that, I am going to toss it over to Carl.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So can you give us a little bit more information about what you do at the garden?
Sure. So I work in the horticulture department. I'm with the collections division. More specifically, I work with our Airoid collection. So that's most famously, those are our corpse flowers, the Amorphophallus, philodendrons, Monstera, Caladium. It's a broad family, and it's housed mainly within the tropics at the conservatory.
Oh, wow. Awesome. And today we're going to be doing air layering. So can you just give us a little explanation about what air layering is?
Yep. So air layering is a propagation technique. Essentially, you are girdling a stem. And so what you're doing is you're encouraging the stem to put out roots where you girdled it, while not totally cutting it off from the mother plant.
Awesome. And you're going to explain you're going to explain what girdling means when we get into the actual demo, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Awesome. And propagating plants, that's just making more plants, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. So even, sowing seed is propagating plants, vegetative cuttings. There's many different techniques to propagate plants.
All right. And so today we're focusing on air layering.
Mm-hmm.
Do we use air layering at the garden? Have you used this technique for our collection?
Yes. So we do house some rare plants that don't have much documentation on propagation techniques. So if you think of something very common like a tomato, there's books on how to propagate tomatoes from seed and otherwise. We have some things that are rare and endangered that common techniques don't quite work on. So this is something that we'll also try.
Very awesome. Thank you for sharing that. It's interesting to know how this technique is used in practice for us, but I think people would really like to see it in action. So would you like to show us a little demo and how it's done?
Yep. So we're going to be demonstrating on this rubber tree, Ficus elastica, and I'm going to turn this a little bit. And so the first thing I'm going to do is create some space for myself to work. And so I do that by removing some leaves. As you can see, this plant is in really good shape, which is definitely something you want to look for before you do something like this. I wouldn't recommend doing this on a plant that's struggling. And so me removing these leaves isn't really going to hurt anything. So,
and you're using pruners. Could you use sort of any sharp object to cut off those leaves, or?
Yes. So sometimes I use the knife that I'm going to do the girdling with. Pruners are kind of the safest way to do it. It depends on what you're working with too. Pruners work really well in this application. You might use another tool. Basically, whatever you're comfortable with. And so what I've done here, let me rotate a little bit, is I've kind of created a space here for myself to work. So now I can sort of take a look and see where I want to kind of make this first incision. And just another tip, on ficus, you have this latex, milky white latex sap. Some people are allergic to it. You may want to wear gloves when you do this. If you have any kind of sap allergy, I would recommend wearing gloves doing this because you're going to get exposed to a lot of the sap, whether it's cutting the leaves off or making the incisions. So yeah, gloves are an option, and I like to keep a spray bottle with water when I'm working with ficus because it actually slows down the flow of this sap.
And that spray bottle just has water in it, is that correct?
Yep, just plain water.
Mm-hmm. Is that issue just for fig trees, the sap issue, or is that anything that you're doing this technique with?
Well, so the allergy thing is totally personal. Everyone has different allergies, but this milky white latex sap is a signature feature of ficus plants. There are other plants that have it, but for today, we'll just talk about the ficus.
All right, jump on in.
So I'm going to go ahead and make the first cut. So we make 2 cuts. Basically, what I'm looking at is I'm kind of sizing up where do I want the beginning of my new plant that we're going to grow from this air layer to be. So I'm looking at the stem, I'm kind of getting an idea of the height, and I'm picking a spot, basically. So I like to start with the bottom. Another key thing to note is it's good to use a really sharp knife for this. You don't want to be pressing really hard. You can run the risk of cutting yourself. And so I use a really sharp knife, and I go very slowly and carefully. So I'm making the first cut. Go around one side, and then around the other, and it's important that you go all the way around. And I will show you why when we get to the third cut. So I've made my bottom cut, and then I'm going to make my top cut. And so this is essentially the size of the girdle. So it depends on the plant, but for this particular application, I'm going to do about 3 inches from the bottom cut to the top. So I'll go ahead and make that cut.
And as you're cutting, does it matter where you do the cut? Can you cut, like, should you be cutting between where you removed those leaves, or how should you be doing that? Does it matter?
I am cutting, so everywhere a leaf comes out on this stem is called a node. And on this particular plant, the nodes are pretty close together. It'd be really hard for me to do an air layer on this without including a node in that 3 inches. You don't need a node within the girdle to be successful. Some vegetative propagation techniques, you really need a node. You need a node below the soil, or depending on the plant. But with this, I think it's optional to include it or not. I'm going to go ahead and include it. So I'm actually including 1, 2, 3 nodes in this cut. Okay, so very carefully going around the back. And so now I've made my 2 horizontal cuts. I'm going to make my vertical cut. Again, I do this really carefully and slowly because at this point, everything is pretty wet and slippery here, and I'm using a sharp blade. So now I've made my 3 cuts. I'm going to start to remove the bark from around the stem. I like to use the edge of the knife.
So Carl, while you're doing that, I'm just going to show a quick slide here of what you just did. So the top and bottom cuts, and then the side cut, so people can sort of see it up close. Removing the stem now, or removing the bark?
I'm removing the bark. And so at this point, you'll find out if your top and bottom cuts were deep enough. Because if they aren't, the bark won't come off in this kind of nice little ringlet. And so I did find that on one part, my bottom cut wasn't quite deep enough. So it's no problem to go back and just gently cut a little deeper.
And how do you know how deep to make the cut?
So that is very situational. On this plant, this is a pretty thin stem that I'm working with today. It's a little thinner and younger than what you might want to work with. So I kind of have to weigh 2 or 3 different variables. If I don't cut deep enough, usually what will happen is this wound will just heal over. And so nothing will root out, the wound will heal, and it'll be almost as if nothing ever happened. So basically, you may lose the time that you invested, but you won't lose any of this plant. It will heal over. So that's the worst case scenario if I don't cut deep enough. If I cut too deep, this stem here that's supporting quite a few leaves could lose its structural integrity and snap over. I've actually had that happen more often than I've had them heal themselves. So that's a little bit more risky, and I'm keeping that in mind as I kind of start to scrape away more of this vascular tissue here.
So if we're looking at this image here, which layers are you looking to remove, and which layer are you looking to get to kind of in your stem?
So we've removed both the outer and the inner bark, and on a more mature plant, those 2 layers would be more distinct, but we've removed the outer and the inner bark, and now we are into the cambium cell layer, and we want to kind of gently scrape away at that cambium tissue and get into the sapwood.
Great.
So on this plant, to do that, I like to take my blade and hold it flat and just kind of gently scrape along. And this way, I'm not removing anything too quickly. It's kind of a way to play it safe. But I can see that I'm removing anything really that's kind of greener, more vegetative, and I'm getting into that sapwood.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also keeping in mind that as I do this, I'm weakening this stem. So just cleaning this up a little bit. And so, as I mentioned, now we've girdled this stem, we've made it weaker. And so one extra step I like to take is to add some bamboo stakes on either side to give it a little bit more strength while we wait for it to root out. So I'm going to do that next.
And Carl, while you were scraping, if you were scraping over a node, and while you're setting up your bamboo stakes here, did you scrape over the node head as well?
So when you get past, on most plants, when you get past the bark, the inner bark and the outer bark and into the cambium, you can't really even tell very easily where the nodes were. So this is kind of just a smooth surface up and down. But there were nodes here, but they're no longer in the way. And so when I cut my bamboo stakes, I like to kind of line them up with my girdle here, and I'll do about 3 times the length. Okay. So I've got the length of my cut, at least that much on the top, and at least that much on the bottom. So if my cut was 3 inches, my bamboo stake is about 9. And today I'm going to be doing 2. You could do 3. It all depends, whatever you're comfortable with. But I'm going to start with just these 2 and see how it goes. So this part is a little tricky. You really want to get them as snug as possible up against the stem so they're effective. And what I'm going to do to attach them is I'm going to use this Velcro florist tape. We used this a couple more times, but this is the first time I'm going to use it. So I take my bamboo stakes and I'm wedging them up against the stem as tight as I can. It's kind of a tricky part of the process. And then I'm wrapping with my Velcro florist tape and securing my stakes. So this Velcro florist tape is kind of a new thing in this application. In the past, people would use wire, like twisty wire. Mm-hmm. The problem that I ran into with that is the wire rusts, and then you end up having to clip it off, whereas this I can reuse.
Very cool.
So I got the bottom. Now I'm going to cut myself a little bit more and get the top.
So Carl, as you're doing this, can you just share out how you decided to make your cut 3 inches long as opposed to like 1 inch or 7 inches, or like how did you determine the length of the girdle cut you made as your bamboo is skewering there?
So I consider a few different things. Just like when I was removing the leaves, I'm creating space for myself to work. Mm-hmm. As I create this girdle, I'm also creating space for myself to work. So 3 inches is kind of a luxurious amount of space. I was really able to get my knife in there. I can really see what's going on. I'm going to have a lot of surface to brush rooting hormone on, which is going to be the next step. But at the same time, I wouldn't have gone any bigger than this because, again, we're weakening this stem. So in this application, I'm going to 3 inches, but that could vary.
Thank you.
Yeah.
People in the chat are very excited about the Velcro floral tape.
Oh, it's a game changer. So one thing that I also like to do, so now I've done the top and I had the bottom. Now I notice that the bottom is loose. So usually I'll go back. Sometimes I go back and forth a few times the more snug you get these stakes up against the stem, the stronger this brace is going to be. Okay, so now that is nice and supported.
And does it matter where you put the bamboo skewers in relation to like how the tree is growing or the plant is growing, or?
Yep, so just like if you were bracing a tree in your yard, you would brace it to hold it against where you think it's going to fall. So I'm looking at this stem and I'm seeing that it's leaning this way pretty heavily. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to brace against that, and then I'm putting a top brace on the opposite side of that.
Great, thanks.
Yep. So our next step here, and this, just depending on the plant species and depending on the person doing it, some people view this as optional. I don't think that it hurts to do what I'm about to do, and what we're going to do is add some rooting hormone. So this is a medium strength. This is a number 2 rooting hormone, and I'm using a powder form. Mm-hmm. I like the powder for this better because it sticks to the wound, and I'm using a little watercolor paintbrush to apply it. A Q-tip also works. I just think the paintbrush is a little easier to maneuver and a little more fun to use. So basically, I'm dusting all over this wound here. If you open one of these up while it's kind of in progress, mm-hmm. you'll see that if everything goes according to plan, it'll start to callus. And I've seen them only callus at the top. I've seen them only callus at the bottom. I've seen this whole section covered in callus. And what callus is it's a precursor to roots. So it's the need to divide.
Great.
So for that reason, I cover the whole wound.
Awesome. I'm just going to quickly pop up some slides here for people to see the last 3 stages that you did. So the number 4 here, I believe, is cutting off the outer layers of the bark there. Yep. And getting to the sapwood. And then 5 is putting up your bamboo stakes. And then 6 there is you applying some root hormone. So it's some nice close-up images for people to see sort of what you did.
Yes.
Right. So toss it back over to you.
Okay. So we have our girdle and we have it supported and we've applied some rooting hormone. So the next step is to apply our sphagnum moss. So that's the next material. I've got some New Zealand sphagnum moss here. You can use any kind. This kind is kind of nice because it's a longer, basically the pieces are longer so they hold together better. And what we're going to do with this is take about a softball size amount, maybe a little bit smaller. And this will also vary depending on the size of your layer. I suggest that you err towards the side of more moss than less, because what's going to happen is when this begins to root, it's going to be rooting into your moss. So this is essentially your container. And if you've ever grown plants in a container before, you know that the smaller the container, the less area there is for the plant to root, the more you're going to have to water it. And so, yeah, for that reason, I tend to do a little bit of a bigger clump of moss. So then what I do is I take it, and what I have here, I don't know if you can see because it's clear, is basically this is just a sandwich bag. And I've cut the sides off and I've cut the top off so I can fold it, unfold it. And what I do is I place the moss in the middle of the sandwich bag, and I kind of split it down the middle because this is going to wrap around our stem here. So just to show you.
Yeah, it's like if you could hold it up a little bit to get perfect. Thank you.
So I've placed the moss in the middle of the bag. I've split it down the middle, and I'm ready to kind of take it and wrap it around the stem. This step is a little precarious, especially if you're just one person doing it by yourself. You only have 2 hands. Basically, I'm going to try and clump it onto the stem and wrap it, and then come back again with my Velcro florist tape and wrap this bag around the stem.
Great. And that sphagnum moss sitting in there, I think you described it once as like a bird's nest kind of looking thing when you've got it kind of ready to go. Is that accurate?
That's a great description. Yeah, so it does look pretty much exactly like a bird's nest.
Great.
So I take it, and I like to kind of try to use gravity to my advantage here. So I'm going to start by coming from the direction that the stem is already leaning. And I kind of nestle it up against the bottom here. I'm pushing the sphagnum moss up a little bit because I want some space of just bag at the bottom to wrap the tape around.
Mm-hmm.
And then I am kind of grabbing this and wrapping it at the same time. So at this point, you might be like, oh, I wish I had put a little bit more moss in. And you have a much easier opportunity to add moss once you wrap the bottom of this. So that's usually what I do. Get the bottom nice and snug. And then I am sealing off the bottom of this. So I'm wrapping this around the stem, the braces, and the plastic bag.
So would you suggest if you're just starting out with this, maybe having a partner helping you with this step?
That could definitely help. And I've seen other ways of doing this part. So you can see what works for you. This is the way I've had the most success with. Mm-hmm. Some people will leave the bag whole instead of cutting off any part of it, and they try to kind of rip it open as they attach it and then just seal it up like a regular plastic bag. For some people that works. This works for me. It could also be easier with another person.
Yeah.
So I'm adding a little bit of moss because now I can see that it could use a little more.
And are you getting it right up against the bamboo skewers in there and sort of pressing it up against the wound, or do you need more air in there? What's the ideal scenario?
So one drawback to the bamboo supports that I added is it does create this kind of these two little lanes of space up against the stem. Mm-hmm. It's like a millimeter on either side of air pocket. So because I did that, and you would want to do this in general, I'm kind of just looking inside here and making sure that the moss is really snug up against. And once I've looked at that and decided I'm happy with it, I can start to wrap the rest of the bag and get ready to close up the top. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm creating a little environment for this plant to root into. And it doesn't need to be an airtight seal, but the better I seal this, the longer it will hold moisture. And keeping this moist is important because if it dries out, especially at the critical stage where the plant is starting to root out into the moss, the root tissue will die.
So do you just seal it and it's done? It's like a little terrarium for the whole time, or do you have to reopen it and water it intermittently?
You have to reopen it and water it. And so, like I said a little bit earlier, if I did this very small, if I was trying to conserve sphagnum moss, mm-hmm. I would end up having to water it more often. So with something like this, it's going to be different at home, but in the greenhouse, I end up watering these probably once a week.
Okay.
So what I'll do is I'll open them up, I'll check for moisture, and if they're dry, I'll come back with my mister bottle and make sure that they're fully saturated. So we've got that wrapped with our plastic bag. And now this is pretty close to the final step. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this tin foil. This is about a 1 foot by 1 foot piece. Mm-hmm. And what I'm going to use this for is to wrap the outside of the air layer and reflect light. Because as you can imagine, if I take this and put it out into the sun right now, it's a clear plastic bag. The light is going to penetrate the bag, and you're going to have this miniature greenhouse effect within the air layer that would cook any potential roots. So I like to take the tin foil and fold the edges a couple times. It makes it a little easier to work with and also gets it down to the right size. So kind of like my bamboo stakes, I want my tin foil piece to be, twice as big or 3 times as big as this whole air layer situation here. It needs to be big enough basically to wrap it around.
Yeah.
So,
Carl, while you're wrapping, do you want to squeeze all the air out of there as you're wrapping, or do you want to leave a little bit of air inside?
You don't want too much air. You really want as little air as possible. If you squeeze the moss too much, you're going to squeeze out a lot of moisture.
Mm-hmm.
But you do want to try and press that air out.
Okay, thanks.
So now I'm coming in with my tin foil and doing a quick wrap. One thing that happens when you're checking them daily, or not daily, but however often you're checking them to see if they need water, the tin foil becomes really brittle and will start to rip. So you might need to replace the tin foil at some point during this process, but it is an important step. Okay, and so now I have that pretty much wrapped up. The end result basically looks like a baked potato tree. And that's kind of what you want. You want this sort of neatly crimped little potato, basically.
Awesome.
Yep, and so then it's complete.
All right, let me show a quick close-up of what you just did for people so they can see as well. So 7 there is you putting on the sphagnum moss. And is that sphagnum moss, is that sterile naturally? Do you use it to decrease the odds of creating an infection in the cut, or is it just, it's a good way to get moisture to the wound?
Sphagnum moss naturally repels, I think, fungal growth. So it's not technically sterilized, but it also tends to stay pretty clean throughout the process.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Number 8 there is you putting the plastic around, and number 9 is you creating your little air layer baked potato on the plant with the tin foil, with the aluminum foil there. All right.
So now we're gonna open one up that is about 2 months old. One thing that you might want to do when you do these is take a little tag on a string and write the date when you did it. That can start to give you an idea of how much longer to expect, especially if you're doing multiple. And
is that a corn plant there?
Yep, this is a corn plant. So this is a different plant. This is a technique that works on a lot of different plants.
Mm-hmm.
So today, what we're doing both tropicals, house plants here in DC, but you can do this on outdoor plants. A lot of people have success with this on nut trees, which are notoriously hard to root. Air layering is a great way to propagate, macadamia, hazelnut, things like that. So I'm going to open this up. And so what we have essentially is a rooted cutting that is still attached to the mother plant. But this cutting has developed its own root system above where we garbled it. So I'm going to cut this off and see if I can bring it up a little closer to the screen. So
awesome.
You can see we've got our moss, and it's all kind of holding itself together now because the plant has rooted out into the moss.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, at this stage, we're pretty much done. I like to kind of look up into the moss and see how much stem is still there. This is the kind of thing that would make it really tippy as we go to pot the plant. So I like to just kind of get up up as far as I can go without cutting off any of these nice new roots.
Carl, could you, when you're done cutting, could you hold that up to the camera a little bit, just sort of roots forward, and see if we can get a nice close look at what you just did. Yeah, you can bring it even closer too if you're able. Brilliant.
Yeah.
So people can sort of see that there. Fantastic.
Yeah. So this was a successful one. Like I mentioned in the beginning, the sort of the best worst case scenario is that the plant will heal itself over. And that, basically all you lose with that is time. But what's nice about this one is it didn't snap. So that's something too.
And then how do you know when it's like really ready to take it off the plant and pot it?
So that can kind of be a matter of opinion. I guess what I look for is I'm looking at the size of the plant that I've done the air layer on. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of visually looking at it and thinking, how much of a root system is this size cutting, basically what we have now, going to need to support itself? And this is a pretty large plant.
Yeah.
It's about 1.5 feet. It's got a lot of leaves. I might cut some of those lower leaves off. If this was just poking out 1 or 2 roots, I would say it's not ready. That root system isn't going to be enough to support the plant once I cut it off its mother. Mm-hmm. But this one, the bag was basically full of roots. It's rooted out really well into the sphagnum. I've kind of made that assessment, that judgment call, and decided it's ready to go.
Great. And I'm just going to show everybody a close-up of what you just showed us in some slides here. So I think 10 is what it looks like before you've sort of cut it, right? That's you seeing that the roots are long enough to cut it off. 11 is actually you removing it from the original plant.
That's right.
And then 12 is you sort of trimming it back to get the roots ready to pot.
Yep, exactly.
Brilliant. And so the next stage would be putting it in a pot. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. And for this size plant, if we could just talk through what size pot would you be putting it in? It would just be like potting any other plant, right? At this point, it's just like getting any plant.
Yep. So I would probably use something about this size. Mm-hmm. Again, it's going to be a little while before it roots out into this larger pot, but as far as stability goes and the size of the root system, I would say this is pretty appropriate size for this plant.
Awesome. So can you use this technique with any type of plant, any type of tree, or are there certain ones that you think work better with than others? Someone had a question about cherry trees or different types of shrubs,
Yep. So it really can be applied to a broad group of plants. It's kind of it won't work with everything. Like you really can't do this with things that don't develop any sort of firm stem. So things that are kind of floppy, it's not going to work on that. One of the reasons that people do this, so this is kind of a labor-intensive propagation method compared to other things. And so one of the reasons people do this is because certain plants really don't root well from other methods. So it's kind of like not a last resort, but another tool in your tool belt that's maybe not the easiest, but it has its pros. And so another one of those pros is you can see how large this plant is. If I had just cut this off the plant and stuck it in a rooting media with some hormone, this would be too much plant for that cutting to support. But because we did it like this, we're starting right off the bat with a large, nice looking plant.
And what would be the largest size branch you'd want to use for this sort of propagation technique?
So it depends. I mean, it's kind of something that you get a feel for as you do more of them. Mm-hmm. The first thing I'm looking at is, if I'm going to do an air layer at the bottom of this stem, is the stem going to snap? Have I done it too low? If I look back at our rubber tree, just bring that back up to the front. If I start an air layer right here, the structural integrity, that would be issue number 1. And then just the idea of this much plant plant tissue to support, I'd have to really do a huge air layer and try and get a huge root system before I could cut it
Oh,
off.
wow. Okay.
You're kind of weighing all these things against each other.
We've had a question about the knife that you used. Could you use an X-Acto knife? This person has used them for grafting, but would you recommend those for air layering as well?
You could definitely use an X-Acto knife. What I look for in an air layering knife is basically the same thing I look for in a grafting knife. Really sharp, comfortable in my hand, kind of nimble because you're doing that sort of awkward girdling around the stem motion.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, an X-Acto knife would work great. It just needs to be really sharp and grippable and comfortable for you to use.
Awesome. And do you recommend using distilled water in your spray can? Does it matter what type of water you use in terms of like mold reduction?
Unless you're working with a plant that's really salt sensitive, I don't think that's hugely important. One of the examples I gave earlier of something that is a group of plants that lends themselves to this technique is nut trees. And I know that certain nut species, I think the last one I saw do this was macadamia. They can be really salt sensitive or pH sensitive. So if you know that about the plant that you're attempting to air layer, then I would say, yeah, go for it and use distilled water. But generally, it doesn't matter that much.
Okay. So how long does it really take for roots to form? I know this will vary from plant to plant, but like for the fig tree for the rubber plant tree that you just did, how long will it take, do you think, for those roots to form?
So, like you said, it'll vary. When I'm doing these in the greenhouse, it will take about 2 months. So I would say if you're doing this at home, it will definitely take longer.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it depends on the species you're working with. I would say that as best as you can, you should try and set up the growing conditions to be ideal for it to thrive. So if you have a plant that's thriving in a certain spot in your house and you want to do an air layer on it, you should then put that plant back in that spot. So an ideal spot for the plant is going to be an ideal spot for it to be this air layer sets. The main environment that we're really controlling is inside this tinfoil mound.
Mm-hmm. So having said that, can you do this with plants that are outdoors?
You can. There's going to be a seasonality with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that seasonality would probably be in line with any other propagation method besides seed for your outdoor plants. So let's say you wanted to take a vegetative cutting of a shrub you have in your front yard, and you know that you're not going to be successful if you do it in the dead of winter. That same rule would apply with the air layer.
Okay. So you'd want to do it when the plant is healthy and growing and doing its thing.
Exactly. And I mean, we have below freezing temperatures here. This wet mound of moss would definitely freeze if you did it in the wintertime.
Good point. We don't want frozen baked potatoes. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. If you're looking at a plant, would you recommend doing this on the second or third year of growth rather than like the sort of new growth that's emerging from the plant, or does that matter?
Well, I would say second or third year, yes. And generally, you want something that has woody growth.
Okay.
Because you want that strength in the air layer. Otherwise, it will just snap on you. If I tried to girdle, something like this up here,
mm-hmm.
it would be really, really delicate. The bark is so thin, and there's really just more cangular and vascular tissue going on in here than bark.
Yeah. So
not that much for me to work with. So the more mature to a point, the better.
Noted. We did have a question about the rooting solution, mm-hmm. and just this idea of what ingredients or properties should you be looking for in a rooting solution? Like you said, a specific level of rooting solution. So can you explain a little bit more about that?
So without using any brand names, I can say that most rooting hormones tend to indicate the strength of mm-hmm. the actual active ingredient inside the rooting hormone.
Yeah.
So this is a level 2 for this brand that indicates medium strength. I tend to go with the lowest strength possible that I think will still make a difference. Because if it's not strong enough, the worst case scenario is it doesn't do anything. It doesn't lend any hormonal properties to my cutting. If it's too strong, you can burn the plant tissue. So I would err on the side of caution and go with the lower strength. A lot of people have they see something and they're thinking, I should get the strongest possible one, but that's not the case here. Less is more.
Okay. And is that a little bit of trial and error, just sort of testing it out with your plants and seeing what works best, or do certain types of plants favor certain types? Okay.
Yeah, so woodier plants tend to withstand higher levels of hormone in your hormone compound. So that's basically what those are made for. If you have something that's all soft tissue, that's way more likely to burn from a stronger concentration.
Okay. And when you're doing your cuts and your girdling, if you're working with this plant that has like really short distance sort of nodes, is it okay to use multiple nodes in your girdle cut?
Yep. So that's exactly what I did. So, on a plant like this where the internode, the space between the nodes is pretty short, I included, I think, 3 nodes in the one that we just did. And that's fine. That shouldn't negatively affect anything. I don't think if I didn't have any nodes, I don't think that it would negatively affect it either. But I prefer to include a node or 2 just out of habit.
Yeah. Great. And then what is the benefit of, this is a larger question, but what's the benefit of propagating instead of growing from seed?
Well, the first part of that answer is time. So, this plant from seed to get to the size of the cutting we can get from an air layer, it would take years.
Okay.
So, someone that's producing these plants in a humongous quantity, this method might not be that practical, but let's say, take, for example, another plant in the same genus, another ficus. So Ficus carica, an edible fig like some of us have outdoors in front of our houses. Let's say your neighbor, really liked the fig that you grow and you wanted to share some with them. You could do an air layer and give them a pretty substantial cutting that's going to be fruiting for them very soon, as opposed to growing something from an immature cutting or a seed. So basically, you save yourself a lot of time.
Awesome. Do you have any tips for air layering airoid plants or plants with aerial roots?
Yes. Oh, so let me just add one more part to that last question.
Yes.
So our air layered cuttings are also, depending on where we took them on the plant, we can get a mature plant from this cutting.
Yes.
Which plays a big role if you're looking at something that's fruiting and that's what you're trying to get out of it. As far as air layering, I think you said airoids or plants with air roots.
Yep.
So those things really lend themselves to this. And what I look for, so let's say I'm going to air layer a Monstera, I would look for the start of aerial roots. Or if you can include some, but they tend to get really long really quickly, I would look for the start. And because that plant is already putting out these aerial roots, I know that I don't need to girdle it.
Okay.
To induce that rooting. The plant is already doing it on its own. And me enclosing those aerial roots in sphagnum moss and keeping it cool and dark is only going to encourage that section of aerial roots to grow. So you can air layer those plants without any kind of girdling. You don't need a knife. You might still want to cut some leaves off to give yourself room, but air layering those plants is actually simpler than doing it on something like this.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. What happens if you try 2 layers on the same stem? Would you recommend doing that, or would you avoid doing that?
Well, I've never actually tried that. So when you're doing an air layer, you're sort of allocating resources.
Mm-hmm.
And the energy that it takes for this plant to produce a root system into our air layer is substantial. And to do one right below it, they could inhibit each other. They might both slow each other down.
Yeah.
Aesthetically, if I had to pick one of those 2 plants, I would really only want the top one. It's going to be this kind of mid stuff.
Yeah.
if you're just wanting to make as many plants as possible, it's worth a try.
Okay. Would you suggest doing this with orchids? Is this possible something to do with orchids, or are they too
I had never, I mean, there are various species of orchids. There's a ton of different species of orchids. Yeah. I've never tried it with any orchid species. I can't really think of one that would lend itself. Mm-hmm. I think in the case of orchids, this is one of the less practical propagation methods.
Good to know.
Yeah.
This is an interesting question. So this person asked if they have fruit trees that have been grafted, mm-hmm. and they did this air layering. Would they have to be sure to make sure that they're using the part of the tree they want to reproduce? Like, what if they did the air layer in the part that was the previous graft? Does that make sense?
Yes. So, I mean, you would have two options. If you did the air layer above the graft, you would have a plant that's essentially just the grafted plant. Mm-hmm. But seeing as it's a grafted plant, they probably grafted it for reasons that it doesn't have as strong of a root system as the root stock. Mm-hmm. So if I was going to do that, I would include, so let's say the graft was here, from here up. I would probably go right below to get some of that root stock plant and have that be what I'm having as my root system, and do it just about there.
Okay. So would you then still get the same, or would you have to regraft on the sort of fruit tree you'd want on top of that?
No, as long as you kept a part of the plant that has the desired graft on the top, that would persist.
Great. Awesome. Quick question about the corn plant that you had grafted, or that you had air layered, apologies. What strength hormone did you use for that particular plant? Did you use the same one that you demonstrated on the rubber tree?
I used the same. So I used number 2 for both. Number 1 probably would have been just fine. Higher strength, gets a little risky. I mean, these get woody as they mature. The corn plant less so. They're both pretty robust plants, but mm-hmm. I wouldn't go above medium level of whatever product you're using.
Awesome. And then do you have like a favorite plant that you feel like really works well with this technique, or that you do a lot at the garden?
Oh yeah, it's right here. These rubber trees, this is like the perfect plant. I mean, when you girdle these and you make your 3 cuts, the amount of times where I've done those 3 cuts and had the bark just pop off in a perfect little circle, these rubber trees really lend themselves to it. And the fact that these are more common, they're accessible. If you're trying this at home and you want to experiment with something, you should do it with something that, you could replace if it goes wrong. And this is a pretty easily replaceable plant. When I do this on some of our rarer or endangered plants, mm-hmm. I definitely go a lot slower. I'm more careful. I make sure that the part I'm air layering is not the most essential piece of this plant. If the air layer fails, if it breaks, if it falls off, this plant's not going to die. With something like this, you can kind of experiment more freely.
Awesome. There was a question about repotting. So once the cut stem hardens off, the plant can go directly into your preferred potting soil mix, or should it go in sphagnum first and then go into some sort of soil mixture?
I go right into a well-draining potting soil mix. Mm-hmm. Some people like to be really detailed with removing the sphagnum from the root system, because sphagnum moss and a potting media are going to take up and hold moisture at 2 different rates, 2 different levels. Mm-hmm. I think that does more harm than good, because that's just a lot of tampering with the root system. So yeah, I just go with a regular well-draining potting mix.
Awesome. And then this person would like to know if you've ever layered Franklinia.
I haven't. That would be a cool one to do, though. That's a really
Yeah. Do you have any other dream plants that you think would be fun to try this technique on?
I mean, the thing that I got really excited about when I learned this technique was, so I'm really into Airoids, obviously, and my first plant love was Monstera Deliciosa. And, we all want that really nice 4-leaf specimen with the huge mature leaf and all the fenestrations. And it's really hard to get that in a compact plant because that's a feature of mature plants.
Yeah.
So when I found out that I could air layer the top of a mature plant and get that really nice, regular size pot Monstera that looks like, the dream Monstera plant, that to me was really exciting. But, a tree like Franklinia that's extinct in the wild, it's pretty rare in cultivation. That's another cool one to try, so long as you aren't afraid of that stem that you're air layering on snapping and possibly losing it.
Good note. Yeah. Well, we have one quick question. Would you also add fertilizer to that potting soil, or would you not do any sort of fertilization?
I would wait for it to root. So just as if you were potting up a plug, a freshly rooted plug, I wouldn't add fertilizer anytime too soon. I would let it root out into the media first.
Awesome. Well, Carl, I really want to thank you for your time today and for answering all these questions and demonstrating how to do air layering. This is a fascinating technique, and I hope that everyone who has joined us today has really learned a lot from it and is excited to try it at home. I hope that if they do try it, they'll share it out on social media and tag us so that we can see the success of what they're doing with their air layering at home as well. So thank you very much, Carl, and thank you to everyone for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, for watching.